Welcome to this webinar by Transparent Choice. Today we've got Rick Morris with us from R Squared, and it's going to be a slightly different format to the ones that we normally do. Usually we invite somebody along, someone who's knowledgeable, who gives a nice presentation. The genesis of this webinar was a little bit different. Rick and I met for the first time a little over a week ago, and Rick kind of issued a challenge to me that kind of said, hey, you know, do we really need fancy project prioritization tools on day one? Or is there another way to get the ball rolling without those tools? So this debate is going to address that. So Rick, it'd be great if we could just introduce R Squared, who you are, who you guys are, and the kind of projects that you work on.
Absolutely, and pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting us. So we've been doing project portfolio management for 20 plus years now. As a firm, we started in 2009. We have 150 plus implementations of PPM software. We primarily work with CA PPM. We feel it's the best on the market, but we've done PlanView, Adaptive, and Workfront, and everything else as well. And what we noticed, and why we even started the firm, was that many people think that PPM is going to be that silver bullet, that they're going to be able to just purchase the software and it's going to solve all their problems and there's no work to be done. And what we also see is that means they're just automating poor results a lot quicker. So coming from a business background and a project management background, we wanted to get involved in the implementation side versus trying to save the value of the software. So we have been involved in implementations and working with organizations through what we call a crawl, walk, run methodology. So, not trying to do everything, perfect right out of the get-go, but let's get some immediate ROI and start building from there. And that's what we've been doing.
Great, thank you for that. So here's my first question for you then. Thinking about, crawl, walk, run, where do you see the quickest and biggest impact potentially on a business? Because when we talked earlier, you were saying that this is really, it's not about implementing a PPM tool or anything like that. It's actually a change management process. It's getting from where you are today to a desired outcome. And when I think of PPM systems, I generally think that I always think of them as being about implementing projects. Not necessarily about picking projects, though some of them claim to do that as well, and in fact do that to some degree. So which of those two activities do you see as having the biggest impact, especially if you're talking about that crawl, walk, run, and time to business results? I'm kind of interested in your history there.
So we absolutely, I think, are aligned in the sense of picking projects. I think the number one issue in every organization is that they have way too many projects and not enough people to do them. And they generally budget, once a year and pick their projects based on what they can spend, but not what they can achievably do. And so our whole crawl, walk, run methodology is about, I would say 3 to 5 years ago, the software solutions just didn't support proper project prioritization or portfolio management because it required so much data in order to pick appropriately. And so the PPM tools were lacking there, and we had to come up with somewhat of a different approach. And so CA PPM, and the reason why we love that tool so much is that, our first really pass of crawl, walk, run is let's just list the investments, let's put a percentage of resources against those investments and see where we are. Before we really start investing in, detailed project schedules and, a resource management philosophy of who gets on what project when. It's more just a quick understanding of this is where we are, this is how many projects we've got going, and can we support them?
Right. So I think that's great because I think in our world we think in a very similar way. That you're trying to get a high-level picture of what you can achieve before you worry about the detail. But picking the right projects and the right number of projects is absolutely key. I mean, just last week we were talking to a PMO in Australia, and they were telling us that they were getting killed because every time they went through the prioritization process with the executives, they'd walk away with a good 30 or 40% too much work. And when that happens, you get into, your implementation teams get into time slicing, and then they become inefficient, and that makes the whole thing even worse. And you start getting project failures and so forth. So I think we're in violent agreement that prioritization is actually potentially a very quick win, actually, but one that adds a lot of value in the portfolio. And it's certainly, in our experience anyway, quicker than the PPM implementation that normally goes alongside. So I'm interested in sort of when you sit down with your clients, how you start that process. Where do you begin this crawl, walk, run process with them on the prioritization side of things?
What's interesting and what we find is there's so many executive staffs that, and I'll just be bluntly honest at this point, that are afraid to make a decision. And so what they tend to do is kind of gum up the proceedings by asking for additional data versus making a tough choice because you've got too many projects, not enough people, and just too many priorities. And so what we try to do is simplify the process to take away the argument. So you've got, the CFO wants to know cost, the CEO wants to know, overall strategy, the CIO just wants enough time to do the projects. And then you get into people, trying to decide these massive algorithms for what is, what's business value to ROI to this and what's more important. And we see people arguing about the algorithm more about instead of picking the right projects. And so what we've done to simplify the process is, we build multiple plans to where we just rank individual values. And then what happens is, so I've got 50 projects, and you can rank that on ROI. Here's your top 10. You can rank that on strategy. Here's your top 10. You can rank that on resource availability. Here's your top 10. And what we're finding is that there's, 7 of those projects that are in the top 10 no matter what. So they're in, so that we can push the discussion point down to the lower level of which projects are out. But not so much about what's the formula that we used and what's the algorithm and which one's more important.
You see, that's really interesting because we hear that kind of story quite a lot, and our worldview actually begins with not so much an algorithm, but certainly a discussion about what value means, right? So what you're trying to achieve as a business, which leads into a scoring mechanism at the end. And what we typically find is that when you do that right, and I emphasize that, when you do that right, when you do it well, that process itself actually adds massive value to the executive team and to the business as a whole. So again, we had a customer went through this a couple of weeks ago, and they had all kinds of problems with, too many projects being, this is the normal thing, too many projects in the pipe, and a real difficulty with the executive team figuring out what to kill off. And in particular, in that example, there were a couple of pet projects floating around consuming a whole bunch of resources at the same time. And the challenge in those situations is that, everybody's trying to sell their project. And when they go through the process using, in this case, they used our tools, obviously, but what you end up having is a very clear and not a very long discussion with executives about their goals and drivers. And then you can see the projects ranked against those goals and drivers really clearly. And naturally what happens is 2 things. First of all, the executives get on the same page. So all those arguments about, my project versus your project, they go away because the execs have a very clear understanding of what the value they're trying to achieve is. And then the second thing that happens is it becomes really, really clear, if you've got the right kind of tools supporting it, becomes really, really clear which projects actually help you achieve your goals and which ones are just, vanity projects or whatever you want to call them. And those vanity projects tend to just fade off into the distance really, really quickly. And so it's interesting because what you described was another way of asking that same question, right? Because it sounds like you by picking 2 or 3 variables and ranking the projects against that variable, and then coming up with a very quick view of how each project, how the projects rank against that variable. Really, you're doing the same thing without actually adding them up at the end, right? You're scoring the projects against each of your variables effectively, and then just kind of putting them side by side to help people make decisions. Is that a kind of fair statement?
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's certainly crawl, and the problem is that people try to do it so perfectly that they never start. And so by doing crawl the way we do crawl, at least we're starting to make some key decisions. But that's all based on poor assumptions that are unsupported with data at this point. Mainly, how long is it going to take to do the project, and how many people really need to work on it? What's their effort level? And so what we're able to do is at least start there, but then as we're utilizing the system, pull through true resource actuals against those investments and start to tighten up the numbers a little bit and start making better decisions from there. But the key is to start.
Exactly. So I think we're actually in violent agreement on that last point, right? The key is to start. And by the way, I don't think there's one right way and one wrong way to do this. You've got one way, we've got a slightly different way. And what I'm hoping that people on the call will take away from this session isn't whether Transparent Choices tools or methodology is the right methodology or whether yours is, but I want them to feel empowered that they can go away and do something tomorrow. Right.
That's for sure.
Started.
I'll be honest, I'm very intrigued by your method, though, because if you look at research and you look at one of the best research books that I've seen around this topic was Dr. James Norrie out of University of Toronto, called Breaking Through the Project Fog. We tend to make our decision based on what we can spend, not what we can achievably do. And not only that, but what is very shocking and revealing in most tools is that once you've made your project selection, it normally shocks them to see where their dollars are going versus where they thought they were going, right? It doesn't match the strategy or the organization. So we believe that strategy and direction is number one, and understanding and picking projects based on that. So it seems that what we're doing is more of a bottom-up approach, which is what you're doing is more of a top-down approach, and bringing visibility to that, to the ultimate core, which isn't money, it's business value.
Well, and I tell you, it's really interesting because I think you're right. And one of the things that we added to the product probably only about 6 months ago, actually, is more about giving you that iterative bottom-up capability as well. So, by that, the decision that we're both talking about, this big decision meeting, you get all the execs in, they're all sitting around the table, they're all looking very important, right? Well, that's the end of a process. And in fact, it's the first time you do that, it's really the middle of an iterative process, right? So it's, before that, you have a period of time where you've got to collect and document and your project requests. You've got to make some rough estimates. You've got to have, do a rule of thumb guess of how risky is this and how many man hours and how much cash we're going to spend and all of these things. And that process itself can actually be quite time consuming and error prone. And so, part of what we've done is we've tied this really rigorous, I'm glad you talked about a research base, because the methodology that we use is based on, 40 years of decision science. So the decision-making piece of it's really, really strong. And what we've done is we kind of learned from our customers that the process running up to that meeting was just as important as the meeting itself. So the ability to efficiently collect that data and to iterate on that data, right, without having to, juggle, a million spreadsheets, is a real. It's both a productivity killer within the PMO when you're working with the spreadsheet, and it's also a break on effective decision making, because if you want to iterate and you don't have a good way of managing the data, making those changes quickly and seeing in real time what effect they have, then it actually becomes more difficult for the executives to sit in a meeting and say, well, what if we did this, and what if we did that, and what if that changed? And so you actually get to the answer much quicker when you have something like this. Now, it does often sound like it's a bit of a big thing to get started with. But actually, we had a client go through this from our very first conversation with the client to them having gone through the executive meeting was about a 3-week period. And that included the time to figure out whether or not it was the right fit, set the system up, get all the projects into it, and run through the evaluation. So, in terms of, I think people often imagine this kind of capability is a big initiative, and really it doesn't have to be. It doesn't need to be.
And it doesn't. And I think that there's a great trade-off there that, what we talk about in collecting this data and doing it right is let's say it, and I don't know the time frame that it takes for you guys, but let's say that's, 25, 30 hours worth of work. What people lose their focus on is that the decisions you make impacts thousands and thousands of hours of work. And so by, doing things smartly up front and killing poor projects before they begin, the amount of productivity and value you can drive to an organization.
Wow, what a great insight. Yeah, that's wonderful. And I'm interested, Rick, do you have any particular hints or tips, again, thinking in that crawl, walk, run process for getting from, let's pretend we've just had the big meeting and we've got a nice list of projects we're going to implement. How do you get from there to having a really effective plan to execute those projects? Any thoughts on that? Because that's kind of an interesting area.
Yeah, one of my favorites is an analogy we call a resource war. And so for every project that's approved, you can either wait for resources to become available, you can acquire resources to do the project, or you can redirect the resources from existing projects. And so one of the first tips that we bring to an organization is it's great that you've approved that now project, through prioritization, but now what's the urgency of that project? Are you okay with the PMO trying to find out when we can do it with existing resources? Or do you want us to analyze the cost of either outsourcing or bringing additional people on to do it, or tell you the impacts of the projects that you will not be able to complete based on, moving this project forward? And so by asking the executives in the prioritization process of what's their level of importance allows the PMO to do some quick analysis and let them know, where this project's going to land. But so many prioritization groups just approve 9 projects but don't understand the impact to the organization of that approval.
That's really, really interesting, and I'll maybe even take it a step further, which is when you have that clear prioritized list. What we see quite frequently, we saw it at EnergyNet, for example, the Danish National Grid. Prior to having this really clear prioritized list, the people implementing projects and the resource owners were forever, between a rock and a hard place, trying to figure out where should they allocate the resources. And as soon as you have this clarity, it became really easy for them to allocate resources. And what they hadn't expected was that actually frees up more resource, because your resources aren't project hopping as often. If you can keep them on task, on the right task, until that task is finished, then they become much more efficient. And so you can actually increase the capacity to get work done simply by figuring out which order should they be, what priority do the different projects have, and then lining your projects up in a way that makes sense, driven by that priority order.
And I think to illustrate that point, one of the questions we love to ask the executive staff is, how often do your priorities change? And the most common answer we get is either once a quarter or once a month. And I think that's fair based on, the change of the market, the change of the customer, new technology, things of that sort. But then we ask, who are the 3 or 4 resources you just simply can't live without? And ask them how often their priorities change, and they're going to answer hourly or daily. That's the most common answer. And so we say, as an executive team, if you're only changing your priorities once a month, who's got the authority to be changing the priorities for your top people? And that's a clear sign that they've got way too much to do and they can't focus on doing any one thing well. The other question we ask is, what's your number 1 project? And that's always funny to us because, unless they've gone through prioritization, everybody's going to answer something differently. And then we go from that point to say, well, do you know if anybody actually, could we walk the floor and find anybody today that worked on any of those projects? Or were they all, in meetings and hopping and running the business and doing everything else that they simply didn't have time to complete the work? And those are very, very insightful questions to ask an executive team.
Absolutely fantastic. And this is all stuff that you can do without spending a penny on PPM software or even on our software. Go out and ask those questions. That's fantastic. Very, very good. So I mean, just to kind of wrap this up a bit, Rick. I mean, I love your ideas. I love the concept of walk, crawl, run. I'd certainly encourage people to come and take a look at how we do things, because actually I think we can get you to run levels of efficiency with crawl levels of effort, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense.
And I look forward to exploring that with you to see if you agree. Maybe we'll come back and record a follow-up to this to see if you agree or not. I'm not sure. Let's be clear. I have not had a chance to dive into your tools yet. This has been exploratory conversations, but I'd love to come back and give opinions once I've been exposed and understand how you guys do things. Well, and again, for the audience, I think what we wanted to do with this was to actually, you've asked a lot of the questions, you've put a lot of the ideas that we often hear when we first engage with people. So I suspect that you've asked the kind of questions or put forward methodologies that a lot of people out there are wrestling with right now. And so having the ability, as I said earlier, there's no one right answer. There are lots of ways of skinning this particular cat. Of course, I would say that ours is the best, wonderful, most amazing. But there absolutely are other ways of doing it. Rick, you've put some ideas forward, and they're really practical, really pragmatic approach. And there are going to be some organizations where that's the right thing to do. So I really appreciate your insight today. And I look forward to digging into more detail over the next few weeks with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.